You may now devote yourselves to the task of rebuilding or the planning of rebuilding, said the Prime Minister Winston Churchill to Bristolians as the war was drawing to a close. Now they faced the problems of laying the foundations of a better Bristol, as the Lord Mayor put it.
The Blitz? The devastation, destruction. Why was it, honey?
The war?
Maybe that's only half the answer.
You mean fire to burn out the evil?
Yes, and a phoenix to rise again from the ashes.
People may not have agreed with the sentiments of that film about the evil in pre-war Bristol, but most would probably have liked the idea of there being a phoenix to rise from the ashes. Much of the city's heart had been destroyed in the Blitz, but even while the war had still been going on, the City Council had been working on a plan for a new Bristol. One where houses, shops and factories would not be jumbled haphazardly together as they had been before. At the end of the war, much of the old city outside the obliterated shopping centre remained. But it had a gap-toothed look to it, where buildings had fallen to bombs. The priority was to provide homes. They were badly needed for returning servicemen and women, bombed-out families, and for those who were still living in pre-war slum conditions. At first, temporary housing in the shape of the famous prefabs was supplied, but gradually sites were cleared ready for new housing to be built. One solution to the problem of accommodation was thought to be the multi-story block of flats, described as an adventure in 20th century and even 21st century living. Memories of the Blitz remained fresh, however. The authorities felt that wartime arrangements for dealing with aerial attack should not be allowed to fall into disuse, as this film shows. The threat of a nuclear war led to the formation of the City Council Civil Defence Committee in 1949, and gradually exercises like this, inspired by the experiences of the Blitz, were changed in order to take into account the dangers of radioactive fallout, something the old civil defence authorities had not had to worry about. Still, despite these fears, and the more immediate problems caused by the austerity of shortages and rationing, the overall tone was one of optimism, as the Festival of Britain celebrations attempted to prove. In the summer of 1951, Bristol, like the rest of the country, joined in the Labour government's celebration of Britain's recovery from the war. The centre of the city was hung with flags, banners and bunting. Even the bomb sites were camouflaged with colourful displays. A major feature in the celebrations was the Bristol Industries exhibition, held in Stoke Bishop. But there were many events, both big and small, including the opening of the newly reconstructed Colston Hall by the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester. Traffic jams were created by those travelling to and from the switching on of the Clifton Suspension Bridge illuminations, and there were unprecedented queues on the Downs after the event as people waited for their buses home. The Lord Mayor urged his fellow citizens to make Bristol a city of flowers, adding that it might be the beginning of a permanent change in our normal outward appearance. Even the Cold War could not dampen the spirits entirely. In 1956, the year that the Russian president, Mr. Khrushchev, told the West, "We will bury you," a civic goodwill delegation from Bristol set out, not without some controversy at home, for the Russian city of Saratov. Its declared intention was to prove our earnest desire for peace and international cooperation, and our sincere hope for greater understanding between the peoples of all nations. The members of the cross-party delegation left from Whitchurch Airport. They flew via London, Copenhagen, Helsinki and Moscow to Saratov, which, as a port, manufacturing and educational centre, was felt to be a Russian equivalent to Bristol. The Bristol visitors, led by the Lord Mayor, were, as they said, treated like royalty, being given smoked salmon and caviar for breakfast, and being put through a punishing schedule of official visits. Some of their observations now sound a little comic. For example, one of the lady visitors was amused because Russian women, unused to such luxuries, thought that her nylon stockings might have been made out of spun glass, and added that a lack of cosmetics meant that women looked rather depressing, especially as there were no hairdressers to create elegant styles for sets or perms. Sadly, much of the good that the visit might have achieved in terms of the way in which Bristol saw its potential enemies was undone when, in the week before the first public showing of this film, Russia invaded Hungary. As far as the council was concerned, the focus for rebuilding after the war was the replenishment of housing stock. In the immediate post-war period, this meant that their policy was mainly concerned with the erection of new houses and flats, mostly on green sites at the edge of the city. As a consequence of the 1954 Housing Act, their attention turned to the clearance and replacement of unfit houses, most of which were near the centre. It was estimated that there were 10,000 such properties in Bristol at this time. A good example of the workings of this aspect of Bristol's regeneration can be seen in the redevelopment that took place on Redcliffe Hill. Between 1954 and 1960, the Bristol company of F.G. Warne carried out a rolling programme of filmmaking which traced the changing face of the city. Given an annual budget of about £300 by the city engineer and planning officers department, Warne filmed sites cleared for redevelopment and the subsequent structures that were erected on them. Originally a medieval suburb, Redcliffe boasted a magnificent parish church, fine Georgian houses, shops and manufacturing industries, including the famous Shot Tower that had been there since the 18th century. The panorama, even in 1959, included premises such as the Bristol Cooperative Society, Jeffreys the Florists, Patterson the Ironmongers, and Pet Paradise at numbers 80 to 86 Redcliffe Hill. Proposals for redeveloping the area had been drawn up in 1956. In 1959, on a 3-acre site between Redcliffe Hill and the Bristol General Hospital, 176 flats were constructed in a unified complex of 3 blocks. This scheme was designed to house key workers in the docks, on the railway, and in local industries. The work was carried out by John Lang and Sons at a cost of £500,000, and was the biggest multi-storey housing block in Bristol when it opened in 1960. On the other side of Redcliffe Hill, a larger group of multi-storey units of varying dimensions had already been built. The design and layout followed the principles of the Swiss architect Le Corbusier. Each block contained communal services. There was a nursery school, and green spaces were created between the blocks. In 1952, the council finally started to implement a scheme for the redevelopment of the historic city centre, using powers under the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act. The disagreements that took place before rebuilding started seem to have been almost as bloody as the destruction of the war. The most controversial element was the council's decision to move the shopping centre to the north and down the hill to Broadmead, away from the traditional Wine Street-Castle Street axis. This action went against public opinion, which wanted the historic shopping centre rebuilt. The reconstruction of the city centre was based on the principle of design control. The key notes of the plan, according to the city architect, were safety, convenience, and interest. Traffic congestion was to be eased and diverted by an inner ring road system. Shops were to be in easy walking distance of each other, and buildings of historical interest were to be retained. Land was segregated into precincts, and uniform post-austerity architectural style was imposed on developers. This notion broke down almost immediately. Woolworths refused to accept the need for a uniformity of style, and built their new store on the Horse Fair with its own facade. Major stores such as Marks & Spencer also built premises in their own house style. Of the city's historical buildings, the early 19th century South Arcade was rebuilt, preserving even today a glimpse of an earlier age. Its survival was by no means a certainty, saved as it was at the last moment from the schemes of developers by the city architect. When building work started, the immediate task was to demolish standing structures and clear rubble from the area. The work exposed some of Bristol's medieval past in the form of 14th century quaysides on the River Frome, parts of the castle wall, and some of the cellars below street level. The bridge that formed part of Union Street was also part of this development. Costing £50,000, it was the first pre-stressed concrete bridge to be built in the city. These shots along the old Fairfax Street show what part of the pre-war city looked like, an area that the architectural historian Michael Jenner described as having a particularly happy, rather tatty homogeneity. The development of the Fairfax Street area had begun in 1955. 3 years later, in 1958, some traders described the site as being like the Battle of Stalingrad because of the mess left by unfinished building work. Part of the problem was because of a dispute which went on for 2 years between the City Council and the Cooperative Society. The squabble was over the combined issues of compensation to the co-op for leaving their Castle Street premises and the location of their new store. Eventually, it was built on a site bounded by Fairfax Street, Merchant Street and Narrow Wine Street in 1959 and named Fairfax House. At St James Barton, the half-completed road was part of an inner ring system designed to ease traffic flow around the city centre. Whilst it succeeded in doing that, it effectively made an island of the new shopping centre by cutting it off from the rest of the city. In 1954, on the corner of the Horse Fair, a new shop was having its foundations laid. Lewis's £1.5 million department store was being built on the site of the 17th century plague cemetery. The bones of the plague victims were exhumed and reburied in Avonview Cemetery at St George. The building of such a huge store destroyed a pleasant open space. This was at variance with the council's original intentions in developing the shopping centre, which had allowed for the retention of such spaces. From design control, the redevelopment of the city centre was disintegrating into a shambles. The situation made more surprising considering the length of the consultation period before work started. As Lewis's store took shape, however, it became evident that its design and that of its neighbour Jones's department store compensated for some of the drearier architecture being constructed in the rest of Broadmead. With its curved frontage reminding contemporaries of an ocean-going liner, Lewis's was completed in 1957. The council's development plans also incorporated the concept of trading estates. This meant a more ordered positioning of industry on specially built sites with good road communications. The Bedminster estate around Willway Street replaced what had been a residential community. The Brislington trading estate, which started towards the end of 1954, is a good example of a post-war planned industrial site. The units were mainly constructed in precast concrete with asbestos roofs. Some of the well-known firms who moved to the estate included Heinz, Walls, and Coca-Cola. After the war, College Green was still much as it had been since the 18th century. In late 1950, it was stripped of its remaining trees and statues and lowered so that Bristolians might have a better view of their new council house. "It's going to make my new building," said the architect, Mr. E. Vincent Harris. Many did not agree. The council house was completed in 1956, 21 years after its foundation stone had been laid in 1935. Running along the back of the council house, from Frogmore Street and Under Deanery Road to Anchor Road, was a street of plain Georgian houses known as College Street. These houses could boast that not only did they provide lodging for the poets Coleridge and Southey, but also the birthplace at number 12 of a pioneer of cinematography, William Freeze Green. In 1954, it was decided to block the passage under the Deanery Road Bridge, which was felt to be unsafe, and thus cut College Street in two. The land on both sides of the bridge could then be developed. That part of College Street which ran behind the council house was demolished between 1955 and 1958 to make way for car parking space and a new municipal building. It seems that when the council house was designed in the 1930s, neither the need for car parking space nor any growth in numbers of council staff had been envisaged. The land to the south of the bridge was developed by Bryan Brothers as a garage complex. The new municipal building was first known as the Deanery Road Project, but was later named Cabot House. Fry's Summerdale factory at Kingsham employed 3,000 people in the early 50s on chocolate and cocoa manufacture. By this time, the company was owned by Cadbury's. The delicate handling and sorting of chocolates was a task undertaken by women workers. A division of labour between male and female employees was also in evidence in the Bedminster tobacco manufacturers W.D. and H.O. Wills. The shredding of tobacco leaf was done in large cutting machines. The automatic cigarette manufacturing was undertaken by machines which produced about 1,000 cigarettes a minute. Again, the handling of the finished product was done by women. George's Brewery, between Victoria Street and the Counterslip, was a rare survival in the post-war period of a major manufacturing industry still occupying a prime inner-city site. In fact, its successor, Courage's, still brews at the same location even today. George's manufacturing process retained some of the traditional techniques used in the brewing industry, particularly the use of wooden casks. And the nice touch of the brewery dray and horse for transporting the finished product. The use of wooden casks required a permanent team of coopers, a highly skilled and labor-intensive industry in its own right. George's had a fairly static labor force of coopers, though even as late as 1958, this extraordinary sequence of the trussing of a cooper could be filmed in the yard of the brewery. This 600-year-old initiation ceremony was performed when an apprentice cooper had completed a 5-year apprenticeship and was thereby entitled to receive indentures. The rarity of such an occasion prompted this film record of the event. The apprentice, Raymond Emery, is rung in. When he's been lifted into a newly made cask, a proclamation is read out by the oldest cooper present. The remaining coopers hammer the truss down over the cask. Raymond peers apprehensively over the top, and not without good reason. He now has his head plastered with soot, wood ash and shavings. As if this isn't enough, he's also drenched in cold beer. The cask is rolled along the ground, with the apprentice inside, At the end of it all, Raymond Emery is declared a journeyman cooper and entitled to the benefits of being a member of the most ancient and honourable society of coopers. The Albion Dockyard formed the core of the shipbuilding company of Charles Hill & Sons Limited, a company that had been operating continuously for 250 years. This was no mean feat, considering the troughs that the shipbuilding industry went through at times. Hills survived by specializing in the construction and repair of small utility ships, such as the sand dredger Norwest, which had its keel laid in March 1955. The stages in the construction of a ship have basically remained the same since the yard's opening at the end of the 18th century. It was the materials that changed over time. The Norwest was built of steel. The plates were chalked out for cutting and arc welded together. After a few weeks, the outline of the ship had already taken shape. The hull was painted and the stern inscribed with the name of the ship, Norwest of Liverpool, the port of registration for her eventual owners, the Norwest Sand and Gravel Company, a subsidiary of the Bristol-based company T.R. Brown & Sons Limited. Launching day was the 10th of June 1955. She'd only taken 3 months to get to this stage, a remarkably short time. The shipwrights are getting the slipway ready for the launch. Richard Hill of the shipbuilding firm and Hazel Brown, the daughter of the owner, stand on the launch platform. The bottle of champagne is broken against the ship and she slides into the water to the tune of Rule Britannia from the brass band. At 148 feet long and 38 feet wide, she's a big ship for the narrow harbour and needs the help of tugs to maneuver in this stretch of water. Now she has to be fitted out. The engine is inserted, and after other modifications to her superstructure are carried out, she goes for trials in the Bristol Channel. Made in 1960, Bristol, port of many trades, was the latest in a line of films that the filmmakers F.G. Warren Limited made for the Port of Bristol Authority. Like the others, it was made as an advertisement for all that the port could do. At the time, Bristol was ranked as the 5th port in the land in terms of handling imports. One of the most important of these was petroleum. Nearly 1 million tons annually was brought in at Avonmouth. About 1,700 vessels, with a total net tonnage of 5 millions, entered the port in that year. Principal imports included animal feedstuffs, cereal produce, grain, ores, and timber and wood pulp for the paper industry. The city docks were still operating, as these shots taken around the St. Augustine's Reach and Wapping wharf areas show. The transit sheds on Wapping Wharf are now home to the Bristol Industrial Museum. Bristol was an importer rather than an exporter. What export cargoes there were usually went out from specially equipped berths at the Royal Edward Dock. The more valuable export cargoes at the time included rail rolling stock, Harvey's sherry, cars, many of which went to America, and even helicopters. No analysis of post-war industry in Bristol would be complete without a review of one of the most extraordinary aeroplanes ever built, the Bristol Brabazon, made by the Bristol Aeroplane Company at Filton. It was Britain's first attempt to build a non-stop transatlantic airliner. At nearly 180 feet long and with a wingspan of 230 feet, she far outstripped in scale anything built for passenger carrying to date, and needed specially built hangars. These are still used today by British Aerospace. The plane failed because the structure was not strong enough to cope with the stresses of such an enormous fuselage, and the plane started to crack up after only 50 hours of flying. The project to build it lasted from 1943 to 1952. In 1968, a new shot tower was being built on Cheese Lane, the Sheldon, Bush and Peyton Shot Company, because their current site on Redcliffe Hill was about to be demolished to make way for a road widening scheme. The original commentator's introduction to this film says it all.
The reason we're building our new tower is that the old tower on Redcliffe Hill has to be demolished to make way for a new road. The last time that Redcliffe Hill was widened was in the 1840s. This house was originally the home of William Watts. 200 years ago, he was a plumber working on Redcliffe Church, and the legend is that he had a dream that he would make lead shot by pouring molten lead from a height and collecting it in a bucket of water. So that he built a tower on top of his house, cutting holes in the ceiling and digging a well under the bottom of the house in order to obtain the full drop that he required. It isn't known what his wife thought of these proceedings.
The lead shot was made by hoisting ingots of lead containing arsenic to the top of the tower. At the top, the lead was melted with antimony in a crucible. When ready, it was released and allowed to drop through a sieve. The size of the holes in the sieve determined the size of the shot which was produced. The length of drop also determined the size, about 40 feet for the smallest, and over 70 feet into the well of water at the base of the Redcliffe Caves to make the larger sizes. Trucks then took the damp shot for drying. After initial sorting, the lead was raised in little cups on a vertically moving conveyor belt to the top of another sorting machine. The shot rolled over glass sheets, which let imperfect globules fall through the gap for remelting. Now, once again at ground level, the grading machine, a pierced cylinder which rotated at a slight angle, allowed the lead shot to fall through the holes. Smallest at the top of the cylinder, larger ones at the bottom. After polishing, the shot was bagged for dispatch to cartridge manufacturers, the steel industry, scientific instrument makers, and the nuclear industry. All of these processes were undertaken with a workforce of only 4 people. Thus, the film shows what is basically an 18th century manufacturing process still being used in the second half of the 20th century. Following the Festival of Britain, the next great cause for civic celebration in the city was the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in June 1953. The festivities opened on a Saturday afternoon with the investiture of Miss Bristol outside the as yet unfinished Council House on College Green. Natalie Gonella, described as a Clifton private secretary, was chosen to represent the youth of Bristol, which she called a nice crowd, and would be seen throughout the celebrations helping to judge competitions and open events. When asked, she said that she was not particularly interested in marriage. She said, "I want to be a successful businesswoman, and I want a fast sports car all my own." On the morning of Sunday the 31st of May, there was a civic procession from Queen Square to the cathedral, where a coronation service was held. On Tuesday, the day of the coronation, a grand all-Bristol sports day was held by the sea walls on Durham Downs. Many sports were represented, as well as the Women's League of Health and Beauty. The prizes were presented by Miss Bristol. On the Thursday, the singer Rose Murphy, accompanied by Miss Bristol, acted as one of the judges in the Western Daily Press's Coronation Decorations competition. She's seen here in a very festive Greenbank Street, Lower Eastham. Miss Murphy was appearing at the Hippodrome at the time of the coronation celebrations and was billed as the Chi-Chi Girl, America's popular recording star. Throughout the week, there were gala nights, the grand finale being at Blaise Castle on Saturday night. They featured the Marcellos, high-wire walkers and cyclists. The Rogers, billed as providing a sensational performance of acrobatics on a standard motorcycle ridden on a high wire at a height of 70 feet. And the Great Bernie, the swaying pole sensation, who at the height of 120 feet rode a cycle upside down, amongst other daring deeds. Street parties were very popular. This one would appear to be in East Street, Bedminster. This is Mansfield Street, Bedminster, which won first prize in the Coronation Decorations competition. Runners-up were Dean Crescent Southville and Penfield Street, St. Werburghs. The main streets of the city were more grandly decorated. The centrepiece was the crown erected in the gardens on the centre. Although Bristol clearly ushered in the new Elizabethan age with great enthusiasm, there must have been some that, in the face of so much celebration, agreed with the person who wrote to a newspaper, "Nothing would give me more satisfaction than to open my morning paper and read that the Queen had slipped quietly into Westminster Abbey the previous day and got herself crowned." Perhaps the most spectacular part of the celebrations was the river pageant, which took place on Coronation Day itself, or Sea Day, as the newspapers called it. The pageant's theme was the journey upriver to Bristol made by Queen Elizabeth I in 1574. Boats, converted to resemble the Royal and Portmaster's barges, were rowed by crews from the National Sea Training School Sharpness and HMS Flying Fox Bristol, respectively. Their Tudor passengers were played by students from the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School, who included a young Barbara Lee Hunt amongst their number. The entourage travelled upriver from Avonmouth to Broad Quay. Once they'd seen the boats pass, people jumped in their cars in order to get to the centre in time to watch the pageant's climax, when the first Queen Elizabeth would land and process through the newly switched-on illuminations to the coronation ball at the Colston Hall. The resulting traffic jam was so bad that it took an hour to drive from Sea Mills to the Suspension Bridge in 6 lanes of traffic, bumper to bumper. 3 years later, on the 17th of April 1956, the real Queen visited the city. In the morning, she arrived at Temple Mead Station. And then went to St. Mary Redcliffe Church. She was shown around the Albion Dockyard on Cumberland Road, home of the shipbuilding firm Charles Hill & Sons. She embarked in the Royal Barge for the city centre. The royal party landed at Narrow Quay and made its way via St. Augustine's Parade and College Green to the new council house. At around noon, the Queen officially opened the council house, described by the Bristol Evening World as a symbol of democracy, and was presented with a brooch representing the flower of Bristol in diamonds and rubies. Thousands had waited for hours on College Green to catch a glimpse of her. The royal party was driven to the Mansion House for lunch with the Lord Mayor. In the afternoon, the Queen opened the new reservoir at Chew Valley Lake. Planned since 1934, Chew Valley Lake had begun once the war was over, in order to meet the ever-growing demand by Bristol for water. The opening ceremony was described as being rather formal and cold compared with the irrepressible warmth of the Bristol scenes. It was further noted that it wasn't until the Queen was leaving did the local children really cheer their heads off. This trade demonstration film shows how to erect a device known as the foulard awning, which was made by Joseph Bryant in Bristol. The foulard awning developed from the firm's experimentation with awnings built onto caravans used as accommodation in the post-war period. By the mid-60s, they produced frames and covering material which was sufficiently light and portable to be used by holidaymakers wanting to extend the accommodation capability of their caravan. The period was a boom time in consumerism, principally as a result of a real rise in wages and the possibility for firms to promote their products on the television and in magazines. Like most novel devices, it was middle-income groups like this model professional couple and their family who were first into the market. Consumerism was not the prerogative of the well-off, however. The fruits of increased spending power spread down the social spectrum. Britain's high streets in the 1960s became bazaars for promoting sales of consumer goods, the majority of which were electric labor-saving devices for use in the home. Made by the South West Electricity Board in about 1960, Power for the West sums up the period as an age of domestic technology. New appliances being developed at this time altered the way the home was run more than they changed manufacturing industry. Between 1955 and 1960, weekly wage rates rose by 25%, and by the end of the next decade had risen a further 88%. In terms of the rise in sales of appliances, the period between 1956 to 1962 saw the number of households with refrigerators and washing machines rise from 8% to 33%. New materials were also being introduced in the manufacture of utensils. Stainless steel pans replacing enameled pots. If there was one facility which had an impact on people's comfort and health, though, it was the provision of running hot water in the home, something that would have been a pipe dream in the immediate post-war period. In Bristol, when the council refurbished slum property or built new homes, a boiler was installed in the kitchen. It gave all their tenants the facility to have hot water on tap, and most new flats had central heating. With this new technology came the need to educate people in how to use it, and, in an age of competition, persuade housewives of the superior refinements of electric equipment for cooking compared to other fuels. The device that probably summed up this drive for convenience more than any other was the Teasmade. In our 3 videos to date, we've shown you just a fraction of the extensive collection of archive film cared for by Bristol Record Office. It's not a complete historical record of the period since 1930. Much of this film reflects issues and concerns that affected the City Council. Many of the social issues that mark this period, such as the building of private housing, popular culture, leisure and sport, do not appear. We'd be pleased to hear about any film material that people may have, in order for us to compile a more balanced picture of life in Bristol.